Hello, and welcome back, dear listeners. Today, we're stepping into a quiet English village on a warm summer afternoon. The kind of afternoon where church bells ring, teacups clink, and everyone has gathered for the one event the whole village waits for all year, the annual baking competition. There is laughter in the air. There is the smell of fresh bread and sweet jam. And there is Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the corner with her knitting, watching, as she always does. But before the day is over, the favorite contestant will collapse after tasting her own prize-winning jam. And what looks like nothing more than a tragic accident will turn into something far darker. A jam jar, a seal of wax, and a killer, hiding somewhere among familiar, smiling faces. This is Deadly Recipe at the Village Fair. If you enjoy cozy, old-fashioned mysteries like this one, do stay a while. Settle in, and let's begin. The fair begins. The village of St. Mary Mead had not seen such a fine morning in weeks. The sky was the pale, washed blue of early summer, and a light breeze moved through the elms along the vicarage lane, carrying with it the smell of cut grass and, faintly, of baking sugar. It was the day of the annual horticultural and home produce fair, though nobody in the village called it that. To everyone from the vicar to the butcher's boy, it was simply the fair, and it had been held on the same stretch of green behind the church hall every July for as long as anyone could remember. Miss Jane Marple arrived a little after 10, dressed in her usual soft grey, a straw hat pinned carefully against the breeze, and a basket over her arm that held, among other things, a ball of pale blue wool and a pair of knitting needles she rarely put down for long. She was 70-something, she had stopped counting precisely some years ago, and she walked with the unhurried steadiness of a woman who had long since made peace with her own pace. "Miss Marple, you're just in time," called Mrs. Bantry, waving from beside the trestle tables where the produce was being laid out. "Do come and see what Dolly Ashworth has brought this year. I do think she's outdone herself." Miss Marple made her way over, nodding politely to Colonel Bartlett, who was arguing, not for the first time, with old Mr. Pruitt about the judging of the marrows. Some things, she reflected, never changed. The Colonel always thought the judging was rigged when his own vegetables did not place, and Mr. Pruitt always took the disagreement rather too personally for a man of 81. The jam table stood near the far end of the tent, shielded from the sun beneath white canvas that let through a soft, buttery light. There were perhaps a dozen entries laid out in neat rows: raspberry, gooseberry, black currant, a rather ambitious rhubarb and ginger from the new woman at the Grange. But it was the strawberry jam at the center of the table that drew the most attention. It belonged to Dolly Ashworth. Dolly was 26, fair-haired, and had a laugh that carried across a room before you even saw her. She ran the small tea shop on the high street with her mother, and she had won the jam category 3 years running, a fact that some in the village found charming and others found faintly irritating, though none of them would ever say so aloud, of course. One simply didn't, in St. Mary Mead. "There she is," Mrs. Bantry murmured, nodding toward Dolly, who stood near the table, adjusting the little handwritten label on her jar with obvious pride. "3rd year, if she wins again. I don't know how she does it. My own jam always sets too hard, or not at all." "I imagine," said Miss Marple mildly, "that it's simply years of practice. Her mother was a very fine cook, if I remember rightly." "Was she?" Mrs. Bantry looked faintly surprised, as though she had never considered that Dolly's success might have an ordinary explanation. Miss Marple said nothing further, but her eyes moved, without any particular urgency, over the small crowd gathering near the jam table. It was a habit she had never quite been able to break, this quiet cataloguing of faces, of who stood near whom, of who smiled and who did not. She noticed, for instance, that Harold Pym, who ran the greengrocer's, was watching Dolly with an expression that was not quite admiration and not quite dislike, but some uncomfortable thing in between. She noticed that Dolly's mother, Enid Ashworth, hovered near the table with the particular tension of a woman trying very hard to appear as though she were not hovering at all. And she noticed, though she thought little of it at the time, that Vera Coombs, who had come second in the jam category for 2 years running, was not looking at the jam table at all, but at Dolly herself, with an expression Miss Marple could not quite name. "Miss Marple, you look terribly thoughtful," came a voice at her elbow. It was young Peter Freeman, the vicar's nephew, down from London for the summer, who had a habit of finding Miss Marple wherever she stood and asking her opinion on things. "Do I?" said Miss Marple, smiling. "I was only thinking how very warm it's turned. Good weather for a fair, though not perhaps for keeping cream from turning." "I don't think anyone's brought cream," said Peter, glancing about. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "I don't suppose they have." The judging was to take place at noon, with the results announced shortly after, and by 11:30 the tent had filled considerably. Women in summer dresses, men in shirt sleeves, children darting between legs with sticky hands and stickier faces. Miss Marple took a seat near the edge of the tent, in the shade, and continued her knitting, though she found herself glancing up rather more often than the pattern strictly required. She watched Dolly Ashworth move about the table, laughing with a group of women, accepting compliments with the easy grace of someone used to receiving them. She watched Harold Pym approach the jam table once, briefly, and then withdraw again without quite seeming to have done anything at all. She watched the judge, a stout, cheerful woman named Mrs. Hetty Cole, imported each year from the neighbouring village of Much Deeping to keep the judging impartial, though Miss Marple privately doubted anything in St. Mary Mead was ever entirely impartial. Begin her slow progress down the table, lifting each jar, examining the set of the jam, occasionally dipping a small silver spoon to taste. It was, Miss Marple thought afterward, a perfectly ordinary morning. Nothing about it seemed, at the time, to hold any particular weight, and that, she would later reflect, was rather the trouble with tragedy. It so rarely announces itself in advance. At 12:15, Mrs. Cole reached the end of the table, and the small crowd that had gathered began to hush in anticipation. She lifted Dolly's jar of strawberry jam last, as tradition seemed to demand, given its reputation, and there was a general murmur of approval as she tasted it, nodded once, and made a note on her card. "Well," she announced, in the bright, carrying voice of a woman well used to public speaking, "I think we all know who's likely to win this year, though I shan't say until the results are properly announced at 2. Miss Ashworth, my dear, would you do us the honour of tasting your own winning entry? A little tradition, I understand, for the favourite." There was a ripple of laughter and a few claps. Dolly, flushed with pleasure and a little embarrassed by the attention, stepped forward, took up a clean spoon from the small dish provided, and dipped it into her own jar. The same jar, gleaming red beneath its careful seal of wax, that had sat on the table since early that morning. "To another good year," she said, laughing, and lifted the spoon to her mouth. For a moment, nothing happened at all. Then Dolly's smile faltered. Her hand went to her throat. The spoon fell from her fingers and struck the grass without a sound, and a heartbeat later, Dolly Ashworth followed it down. There was a silence of perhaps 2 full seconds, the particular silence of a crowd that has not yet understood what it has just seen, and then someone screamed, and the tent, which a moment before had held nothing but the warm, sweet smell of summer and sugar, dissolved into chaos. Miss Marple was on her feet before she quite realized she had risen, her knitting slipping unheeded from her lap into the grass. And as Colonel Bartlett shouted for a doctor, and Enid Ashworth's cry rose above the general noise, sharp and terrible, Miss Marple's eyes, for one brief, unhurried moment amid all the panic, went not to Dolly, but to the jam jar still standing on the table, its lid slightly askew, a thin ring of red wax pooling, unnoticed at its base. A ring of red wax. Dr. Haydock arrived within 11 minutes, having been fetched at a dead run by Peter Freeman, whose bicycle was left lying in the middle of the lane outside the doctor's cottage. By then, Dolly Ashworth lay on the grass beneath the canvas awning, her mother kneeling beside her, refusing to be moved despite the gentle urging of 2 of the fair's stewards. The crowd had been pushed back, not without difficulty, to the far end of the tent, where they stood in stricken clusters, murmuring the low, disbelieving murmur of people who have just watched something happen that they cannot yet fit into the shape of the day. Miss Marple had not moved far. She stood near enough to see, but far enough not to be in the way, a skill she had perfected over more years than she cared to count, and she watched Dr. Haydock kneel, take Dolly's wrist, lean close, and then, after a long moment, sit back on his heels with an expression Miss Marple had seen only a handful of times in her life, and never once mistaken for anything but what it was. "I'm sorry, Enid," he said quietly. "She's gone." The words did not seem to land at first. Enid Ashworth simply stared at him, as though he had spoken in a language she did not know, and then the sound she made was not a scream at all, but something lower and worse, and Mrs. Bantry was there at once, an arm around her shoulders, murmuring something that could not possibly have been comfort, but was, perhaps, all that could be offered. Miss Marple looked away, not from squeamishness. She had seen death before, more times than a woman of her gentle appearance was generally credited with, but because there was, she felt, a particular indecency in watching a mother's grief too closely, even when one could not help but be present for it. Instead, her eyes went, once again, to the table. The jam jar still stood where Dolly had set it down, the spoon lying in the grass a few feet away, where it had fallen from her hand. No one had touched either. In the confusion of the last quarter hour, it seemed no one had thought to. "Nobody is to touch that jar," Miss Marple said, and was faintly surprised by how clearly her own voice carried. Several heads turned toward her, Colonel Bartlett's among them, his face still ruddy with the shock of it. "Miss Marple's quite right," Dr. Haydock said, rising. He was a large, unhurried man, and though his face was grave, there was nothing panicked in his manner. "This isn't a natural death, not with an onset like that. I want to look at that jam before anyone so much as breathes near it, and I'll be sending for the police directly." "Police?" Harold Pym's voice cracked slightly on the word. He had pushed his way to the front of the small crowd, his face pale beneath its usual weathered color. "Surely. I mean to say, it might have been anything. A wasp sting." Her heart, said Dr. Haydock, not unkindly, "was perfectly sound, and I've known Dolly Ashworth since she was in nappies. That was not a wasp sting, Mr. Pym, and I think you know it as well as I do." There was a silence at that. Brief, but not, Miss Marple thought, an entirely comfortable one. It was Inspector Slack, who arrived some 40 minutes later from the county station at Much Benham, driving up the lane in a car that scattered gravel and small boys alike, with the particular briskness of a man who believed thoroughness to be chiefly a matter of speed. He was younger than Miss Marple remembered from previous occasions, though his manner had lost none of its brusqueness. "Right," he said, surveying the tent, the tables, the small knots of villagers still standing about in shock, and the covered form on the grass, with an expression that suggested he found the whole business a great deal of trouble for one summer afternoon. "Everyone's to stay put till I've had a word. Nobody leaves the field." He questioned Dr. Haydock first, briefly, and then made his way, with rather less patience than Miss Marple felt the moment deserved, toward the jam table, where he examined the jar without touching it, bent close, and sniffed. "Bitter almonds," he said, straightening. "Or I'm a Dutchman. Cyanide, unless I miss my guess. We'll know for certain once the analysts had it. But I've smelled that particular scent before, and I don't forget it easily." "Cyanide," Mrs. Bantry repeated faintly, as though tasting the word and finding it entirely unsuitable to a summer's afternoon at the village fair. "In her own prize jam," Colonel Bartlett muttered. "Good God! Who'd want to poison the girl's jam, of all things?" It was, Miss Marple reflected, rather a good question, and one that would, she suspected, occupy a great many minds in St. Mary Mead for some time to come. But it was not, she thought, quite the right question. Not yet. She had moved, in the general shuffle of the crowd being organized into some semblance of order for questioning, close enough to the table to see the jar properly for the first time since the tragedy, and it was then that something small and quiet caught at the edge of her attention, the way a dropped stitch catches at the edge of one's eye before the mind has quite registered what it has seen. The wax. "Jam jars?" in Miss Marple's very considerable experience of them, were sealed in one of two ways when made properly for competition. Either with a disc of waxed paper pressed directly onto the surface of the jam beneath the lid, or, in the old-fashioned manner that some of the more traditional cooks in the village still favoured, with a thin pour of melted wax around the rim beneath the lid itself, to keep out both air and damp. Dolly Ashworth, as everyone in the village well knew, used the second method. She had learned it from her grandmother and made rather a point of it, in the pleasant, unassuming way she made a point of most things concerning her jam. And the wax she used, every year, without fail, was the pale, honey-coloured wax her mother purchased, specially from the chemist in Much Benham, the same soft gold Miss Marple had seen sealing Dolly's jars at this very fair for each of the last 3 summers. But the ring of wax pooled now at the base of the jar. The wax that had, presumably, sealed the lid before Dolly broke it that morning to taste her own entry, was not honey-coloured at all. It was a deep, dull red, almost the colour of the jam itself, which was, Miss Marple thought, rather a clever choice, if one wished such a thing not to be noticed at a glance. She said nothing of it just then. Inspector Slack was a busy man, and not, in Miss Marple's prior experience, a particularly receptive one to observations offered before he had asked for them. And besides, she was not yet entirely certain what it meant, only that it was wrong, in the small, precise way that a single dropped stitch is wrong in an otherwise even row of knitting, easily missed, and yet, once seen, impossible to ignore. She glanced instead toward the small crowd still gathered at the tent's edge, and found herself considering, with a kind of tired, sorrowful patience, how many of the familiar faces before her, faces she had known for years, faces that had smiled at her over garden fences and church socials and 100 ordinary afternoons, might, this morning, have had a reason to want Dolly Ashworth dead. It was not, she thought, a pleasant thing to consider. It never was. But it was, she had long since learned, very often necessary. Miss Marple! Inspector Slack had turned toward her, notebook in hand, his tone carrying the particular impatience of a man who remembered her from before and had not entirely decided whether that memory pleased him. "I don't suppose you saw anything useful this morning. Before all this happened, I mean." Miss Marple considered the question for a moment, her hands folding neatly in front of her. "I saw a great many things, Inspector," she said mildly. "Whether any of them are useful, I really couldn't say. Not yet." Inspector Slack sighed, the particular sigh of a man who suspected he was not going to enjoy this investigation nearly as much as he might have hoped, and turned to his notebook. Behind him, unnoticed, the last of the strange red wax dried slowly into the grass. The colour that didn't match. By the time Miss Marple made her way home that evening, the whole of St. Mary Mead had already heard the news at least twice over, and in at least 3 mutually contradictory versions. She let herself in through the garden gate, deposited her basket on the kitchen table, and sat for some time in her favourite chair by the window, her knitting untouched in her lap, thinking. It was not, she reflected, the poison itself that troubled her most, though cyanide was ugly enough, in all conscience. It was the wax. A person intent on poisoning a jar of jam might, one supposed, simply add the poison and reseal the lid as best they could, trusting that no one would look closely enough to notice. That would have been careless, certainly, but understandable, in the way that most crimes were understandable once one saw the fear, or the greed, or the desperation sitting beneath them. What troubled Miss Marple was the deliberateness of it. Whoever had done this had known Dolly's jam well enough to know it was sealed with wax at all. Not every cook did it that way, these days, with paper discs so much more convenient, and had gone to the trouble of resealing it afterward, with wax of a different colour, in a manner that suggested either great haste or a startling lack of familiarity with how careful Dolly's own methods truly were. It was, in other words, the work of someone close enough to know the jam would be sealed with wax, but not quite close enough to know precisely what shade Dolly always used. Miss Marple found this observation both promising and, if she were honest with herself, faintly troubling. It narrowed the field considerably, and yet St. Mary Mead being what it was, not quite close enough to know the exact shade of Dolly Ashworth's sealing wax, might still describe rather a large number of people. She resolved, the following morning, to pay a visit to Enid Ashworth. The Ashworth cottage stood just off the high street, behind the small tea shop that bore the family name in faded gold lettering above the door. Closed today, its blinds drawn, a single wreath of white flowers already propped against the window by some early and well-meaning neighbour. Miss Marple knocked softly, and it was several moments before the door opened, revealing Enid Ashworth, looking a decade older than she had the previous morning, her eyes red-rimmed and dry now, in the particular way of a person who has simply run out of tears for the time being. Miss Marple. Enid's voice was flat, but not unkind. I'm not sure I'm fit for visitors. I shan't stay long, my dear, Miss Marple said gently, and I shan't ask you to talk about anything you don't wish to. I only wondered if I might trouble you for 5 minutes. It's about the jam. Something in Enid's face tightened, but she stepped back from the door all the same, and led Miss Marple through to a small, neat sitting room, still faintly smelling of the lavender polish Dolly, apparently, had always insisted on for the good furniture. "The wax," Miss Marple said, once they were both seated. "Forgive me for asking something that must seem very trivial just now, but I understand Dolly always sealed her jam jars with a particular wax, the pale, honey-coloured kind, from the chemist at Much Benham." Enid blinked, as though the question had caught her entirely off guard, which, Miss Marple suspected, it rather had. Grief did not generally leave much room for wax. "Yes," she said slowly. "That's right. She always got it from Mr. Fenwick's shop. A little tin of it every spring, enough to see her through the fair and any preserving after. It was her grandmother's way of doing things, my mother-in-law, I mean. Dolly was very particular about it. And this year's tin, would it still be here, do you think? In the kitchen, perhaps?" Enid rose, a little unsteadily, and led the way through to the small kitchen at the back of the cottage, where a row of jam jars stood cooling on the windowsill, the remainder of Dolly's batch, presumably made before the competition entry had been set aside. Beside them, on the shelf above the stove, sat a small tin, its lid slightly dented, half full of pale golden wax. "There," said Enid. "That's what she always used." Miss Marple regarded the tin for a long moment. "Enid," she said carefully, "I don't suppose you happened to notice, when Dolly sealed her competition jar, was it done here, in this kitchen, or elsewhere?" "Here, of course. 2 days before the fair, same as always. I was with her the whole time, helped her label the jars. In fact, while the wax was still setting." Enid's voice caught slightly. She was so pleased with how it turned out this year, said the strawberries had been particularly good. "And after it was sealed, where was the jar kept? Until it went to the fair. On the sideboard. In the front room. We always keep the competition entry somewhere it won't get knocked about." Enid frowned, seeming, for the first time, to follow the direction of Miss Marple's questions. "You think someone came in here? Into the house?" "I think," said Miss Marple slowly, "that it's a possibility one oughtn't to dismiss too quickly. Tell me, who came to the cottage in the 2 days between the sealing and the fair? Even briefly. Even someone you'd think nothing of." Enid was quiet for a long moment, her hands twisting together in her lap. "Half the village, I should think, one way or another," she said at last. "We had customers in the shop, of course, right up until closing the day before. Though the front rooms kept separate, they'd have no cause to go through. Harold Pym came by with a delivery of fruit Thursday morning. He does our greengrocery. And Vera Coombs stopped in Thursday afternoon, though I couldn't tell you why exactly. Some to do about the entry forms for the fair, I believe, though we'd both filled ours in weeks before." Miss Marple's needles, which had been moving with quiet, automatic rhythm throughout the conversation, stilled for a moment in her lap. "Vera Coombs," she repeated. "Did she go through to the front room at all, do you recall?" "Aye." Enid paused, her brow furrowing with the particular effort of trying to reconstruct an afternoon that had, at the time, seemed entirely unremarkable. "I believe she may have. I was called out to the shop for a customer, and when I came back she was standing near the sideboard, though I thought nothing of it. Vera's always been a bit odd that way, restless, moving about a room while she talks. I didn't think, she stopped. You don't think Vera would do such a thing? Not over a jam competition. I think very little as yet, Miss Marple said gently. I am only trying to see the shape of the days before, my dear. It's often the small, unremarkable things that matter most, far more than the dramatic ones in my experience. A visit that seemed to mean nothing at the time very often turns out to mean rather more, once one looks at it properly. She rose, gathering her basket, and pressed Enid's hand briefly in her own, a gesture of comfort rather than investigation, offered with real feeling, despite the questions that had come before it. Thank you, my dear. I am so very sorry about Dolly. She was a lovely girl. Enid's composure, held so carefully throughout the visit, finally cracked, just slightly, at that. She was, she said, and said nothing more. Walking back along the high street, Miss Marple found her thoughts turning, with some reluctance, toward Vera Coombs. She had known Vera for years, a quiet, capable woman in her early 30s who kept house for her elderly father at the far end of the village, and had, for 2 years running, come a respectable second to Dolly Ashworth in the jam category. It was not, Miss Marple reflected, the sort of rivalry that generally ended in cyanide. Jam competitions, however keenly felt at the time, were not, as a rule, matters of life and death. And yet, Miss Marple had lived long enough and observed enough of human nature in all its ordinary and extraordinary forms to know that it was very rarely the size of the thing itself that drove a person to violence, but rather what that thing had come, privately, to represent. A jam jar was, after all, only a jam jar, until it became, in someone's mind, the whole of their disappointment, or their humiliation, or their longing, distilled down into one small breakable object. She was not at all sure, yet, that Vera Coombs's motive, if motive it was, amounted to anything more than an afternoon spent too near an unattended sideboard. But it was, she thought, decidedly a thread worth pulling. She resolved to call on Vera the following day, and, she thought, turning the matter over once more as she walked, the warm smell of the baker's ovens drifting from the shop she passed, she resolved also to have a quiet word with Mr. Fenwick, the chemist at Much Benham, about the tin of pale golden wax, and whether anyone else in the district had recently purchased wax of a rather different, deeper shade. It was, she told herself, probably nothing. She did not, in her heart, quite believe it. A trail that led nowhere. Vera Coombs lived with her father, old Mr. Coombs, in a narrow stone cottage at the far end of the village where the lane gave way to open fields. It was a quieter, more solitary sort of house than the Ashworths. No shop attached, no passing trade, only a small, well-tended garden, and the low hum of bees working through a border of lavender. Miss Marple found Vera in that garden the following afternoon, kneeling at the edge of a flower bed with a trowel in hand, her sleeves rolled to the elbow and a faint sheen of perspiration on her brow despite the mild weather. Miss Marple. Vera sat back on her heels, shading her eyes. I didn't expect visitors today, of all days. Terrible business, isn't it? About Dolly. Terrible, Miss Marple agreed, settling herself, at Vera's gesture, onto the low garden bench nearby. I wonder if I might trouble you for a few minutes. I've been trying to piece together the days before the fair, where everyone was, who called on whom. It seems the sort of small detail the police so often overlook in their haste. I shouldn't think I can tell you much. Vera pulled off her gardening gloves and folded them neatly in her lap, a small, precise gesture that struck Miss Marple as somehow at odds with the rest of the woman's rather brisk, unadorned manner. I called at the Ashworths Thursday, if that's what you mean. Enid will have told you, I expect. She did mention it, yes. Something about the entry forms, I believe. That's right. I'd got it into my head that I hadn't handed mine in properly. Silly of me. As it turned out, I had done, weeks before. I only wanted to check with Enid, since she keeps the fair's paperwork as well as the shop's. Vera's tone was even, almost bored. The tone of someone recounting an errand, too small to hold any real interest, even in the retelling. And while you were there, Miss Marple said, watching a bee move slowly from one lavender spike to the next. I understand you were left alone in the front room for a few minutes. Enid was called away to the shop. Vera's hands, which had been resting quite still in her lap, went momentarily motionless in a different way. Not relaxed stillness now, but the stillness of someone listening very carefully to where a question was leading. Was I? She said. I don't recall it particularly. I may have been. I don't see what it signifies. Probably nothing at all, Miss Marple said mildly. I only wondered whether you happened to notice Dolly's competition jar on the sideboard. It would have been sealed by then, I believe. Quite a distinctive jar with its wax seal. I really couldn't say. I wasn't looking at Dolly's jam, Miss Marple. There was, for the first time, a faint edge in Vera's voice. Not sharp exactly, but present, like a thread pulled slightly too tight. I had rather more on my mind than jam jars, if you want the truth of it. Oh? Vera was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, something in her had shifted. Not quite anger, but a kind of weary honesty that seemed, Miss Marple thought, more genuine than anything she had said before. You want to know if I hated her for winning, Vera said. Everyone always assumes that, you know, when someone comes second 3 years running, that it must eat away at you. She gave a short, humorless laugh. It doesn't, particularly. Dolly's jam was better than mine. It simply was. I've made my peace with that a long while ago. Then may I ask, Miss Marple said gently, what it was that occupied your thoughts that afternoon, if not the jam? Vera hesitated, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought she would not answer at all. Then, with the air of someone setting down a weight she had been carrying too long alone, she said, My father. His heart's not what it was, and Dr. Haydock's spoken to me twice now about arrangements, should the worst happen. I'd gone to the Ashworths with my head full of that, Miss Marple, not jam competitions. I dare say I walked straight past that sideboard without seeing a thing on it. There was a long pause. From somewhere behind the cottage, a dog barked twice and fell silent. I'm very sorry, Miss Marple said, and meant it. That's a heavy thing to carry, alongside everything else. It is. Vera looked at her directly then, and there was nothing evasive in her gaze at all. I didn't poison Dolly's jam, Miss Marple. I'll own I've envied her, now and again, in the small, foolish way one envies a person who seems to have things easier than oneself. But I never wished her dead. I liked her, actually, whatever the fare made of us both. Miss Marple studied her for a long moment, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she believed her. There was a particular quality to real grief mixed with real worry, a kind of exhausted transparency that was very difficult to counterfeit, and Vera Coombs wore it plainly enough. Thank you, my dear, Miss Marple said at last. I'm sorry to have pressed you on such a difficult day. She took her leave shortly after, and it was only as she walked back along the lane, the afternoon sun now warm on her shoulders, that she allowed herself to acknowledge, with a small private sigh, that she had very likely spent the better part of 2 days pursuing quite the wrong thread entirely. It was not, she reflected, the first time she had let a small, visible thing, an inconvenient visit, a moment alone in a room, carry more weight in her thinking than it deserved, simply because it had presented itself so conveniently. Age did not, she had found, make one immune to such errors. If anything, it made the temptation greater, for a tired mind was often more inclined to seize upon the first plausible answer, rather than sit patiently with the discomfort of not yet knowing. Well, there was nothing for it but to begin again, and think rather harder this time. She turned the problem over once more as she walked. If not Vera, and she was now fairly persuaded it was not, then who had been close enough to the Ashworth cottage, in those 2 crucial days, to have both the opportunity and the knowledge required? And who, more importantly, might have had a reason, a real reason, not merely the shallow, easy motive of a lost jam competition, to want Dolly Ashworth dead? Her mind returned, almost unwillingly, to Harold Pym, and to that odd, unreadable expression she had noticed on his face at the fair, the one that had seemed neither quite admiration nor quite dislike. Harold delivered fruit to the Ashworth cottage regularly, Enid had said, which meant he too had reason and opportunity to be near that sideboard, that Thursday or any other day, without anyone thinking twice of it. Miss Marple decided that a visit to the greengrocer's was rather overdue. The stranger at the gate. Pym's greengrocer's stood at the corner of the high street, its awning striped green and white, crates of early plums and glossy cabbages arranged with the particular neatness of a man who took genuine pride in his stock. Miss Marple found Harold alone behind the counter that afternoon, weighing out potatoes for a customer who had just left, and looking, she thought, considerably more careworn than the occasion of a quiet Tuesday afternoon would seem to warrant. Miss Marple. He set down the scale scoop and wiped his hands on his apron. Come for something in particular, or just passing? A little of both, perhaps, Miss Marple said, settling herself near the counter with the unhurried air of a woman with nowhere pressing to be. I did want some of your gooseberries, if you have them, but I confess I also wanted a word about poor Dolly. Something flickered across Harold's face, there, and gone quickly enough that Miss Marple might have missed it, had she not been rather deliberately watching for it. Terrible thing, he said, turning to weigh out the gooseberries with more attention than the task strictly required. Whole village is still reeling from it, I should think. It is. I understand you deliver fruit to the Ashworths regularly. Every Thursday, regular as church. He set the bag of gooseberries on the counter, but did not push it toward her yet, his hands resting on it instead. Enid will have told you that, I expect, seeing as you've clearly been asking about. She did mention it, yes. I don't suppose you happened to notice Dolly's competition jar on your delivery this last Thursday. It would have been on the sideboard in the front room, freshly sealed. Harold was quiet for a long moment, and Miss Marple watched him decide, quite visibly, whether to answer the question she had asked, or the one he suspected lay beneath it. I saw it, he said finally. Course I saw it. Dolly showed it to me herself, proud as anything. Wanted my opinion on the colour of the set, if you can believe it. As though I'd know the first thing about judging jam, being in the fruit trade and not the preserving one. He gave a short, unconvincing laugh. She was like that, though, liked to share good news. You knew her well, then. Village this size, everyone knows everyone. He said it a shade too quickly, and Miss Marple, who had spent the better part of a lifetime listening to what people did not quite say, heard the strain beneath it clearly enough. Mr. Pym, she said gently, I wonder if I might be rather more direct than is perhaps polite. I noticed, at the fair, that you seem to be watching Dolly with a great deal of feeling. I don't ask out of idle curiosity, I promise you, only that feelings, of whatever kind, so often turn out to matter in a business like this one. Harold's jaw tightened, and for a moment Miss Marple thought he would simply deny it and send her on her way with her gooseberries and nothing more. But something in his shoulders seemed to give way instead, the particular collapse of a man too tired to keep holding up a thing he had been carrying alone for some time. I asked her to marry me, he said quietly. Back in the spring. She turned me down. Kindly, mind. She was never anything but kind about it. Said she didn't feel that way about me, and hoped we could go on as friends. He gave a short, bitter laugh. As friends. As though a man can simply fold a thing like that up small enough to fit in his pocket and carry on as before. I'm very sorry, Miss Marple said, and there was real gentleness in it. That's a hard thing to bear, and harder still to bear quietly, in a village where everyone thinks they know everyone's business. I didn't kill her, if that's what you're working round to. His voice had risen slightly, and he caught himself, glancing toward the shop door, as though worried the words might carry into the street. I loved the girl, Miss Marple. Whatever else you think of me, believe that much at least. I do believe it, Miss Marple said, and found, watching him, that she did. There was a rawness to his grief that seemed to her entirely genuine, the particular grief of a man mourning not only a death, but a door that had already been closed to him before it happened, so that he now carried two losses instead of one. But I wonder, Mr. Pym, if you noticed anything else, that Thursday, that struck you as at all out of the ordinary, even something small. Harold was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over. There was one thing, he said slowly. I nearly forgot it, what with everything since. There was a man at the gate as I was leaving, not from the village. I didn't recognize him, youngish, well-dressed, in a London sort of way, if you take my meaning. He asked me if that was the Ashworth place, and when I said it was, he thanked me and went on up the lane. I assumed he was calling on Enid, about the shop's accounts or some such. Didn't think another thing of it till just now. Miss Marple felt something shift, quietly, into place. Not the whole picture yet, but a piece of it, sliding into position with the small, satisfying click of a puzzle, finally cooperating. Did he go in? Do you know? To the cottage? Couldn't say. I'd turned up the lane myself by then, on my way back to the shop. Harold frowned. You think that matters? A stranger at the gate. I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that a stranger at the gate, on the very afternoon a poisoned jar of jam came to be resealed with the wrong color wax, is very probably the most important thing anyone has told me since Dolly Ashworth died. She thanked him, paid for her gooseberries, pressing his hand briefly as Enid's had been pressed, in the same wordless offering of sympathy, and left the shop with her mind moving now at a rather different pace than it had all week. A stranger, well-dressed, from London, or near enough to it. Miss Marple thought of Enid's tea shop, and its ledgers, and wondered, with the particular, quiet excitement of a woman who has just felt the first real thread of a tangle come loose in her hand, whether Dolly Ashworth's life had held rather more than village fairs and jam competitions after all. She resolved to call on Enid once more, and this time, she thought, to ask a rather different sort of question. The truth in the wax. Enid Ashworth opened the door before Miss Marple had even finished knocking, as though she had been waiting behind it for some time. "You've found something," she said. It was not a question. "May I come in, my dear?" They sat again in the small sitting room, though the lavender polish seemed, to Miss Marple's senses, to smell rather more strongly today. The particular over-cleanliness of a house, kept busy by hands that did not know what else to do with themselves. "Enid," Miss Marple said gently, "I spoke with Harold Pym this afternoon. He mentioned a young man at your gate, the Thursday before the fair. Well-dressed, not from the village. He said he assumed the gentleman had come about your shop accounts." Enid's hands, folded in her lap, went very still. "Gerald," she said, so quietly Miss Marple nearly missed it. "Would you tell me about him?" For a long moment, Enid said nothing at all. Then, with the air of a woman setting down something she had carried alone for far too long, she began to speak. "He's a solicitor's clerk, from London. Dolly met him last autumn, when she went up to visit her cousin. They'd been writing ever since. I didn't know how serious it had become, not really. Not until that Thursday, when he came to ask my blessing. Her voice caught. He wanted to marry her, Miss Marple, properly this autumn. And Dolly wanted it too. She told me so, that very evening, once he'd gone. She was so happy. She said they meant to marry quietly and then move up to London, where his position was. She said." Enid stopped, pressing a hand briefly to her mouth. "She said the shop could be sold. That I oughtn't worry. She'd see me settled comfortably wherever I liked, once it was done. And that troubled you," Miss Marple said, very gently. It was not an accusation. It was simply the truth, offered quietly, so that Enid might take it up, or set it down as she chose. "I have nothing else." Enid's voice, when it came, was raw in a way it had not been even in her freshest grief. "My husband's been gone 11 years. The shop is everything I built, everything I have. And Dolly was everything besides. I couldn't bear the thought of this house without her in it, and London so far, and a man I'd met exactly once standing between us." She looked up, and her eyes were terrible with a grief that went beyond the simple loss of a daughter into something far more complicated and far more human. "I only meant to make her ill, Miss Marple. That's God's own truth. Ill enough that the wedding might be put off a little. Ill enough that Gerald might see how much she needed looking after, here, by me, and think better of taking her so far away. I've some skill with herbs, you understand. My grandmother's teaching. Harmless things mostly. Tonics and such. And I thought, foolishly, I could judge an amount that would only trouble her a day or two. I didn't know. Her voice broke entirely. I didn't understand how little it would take, of what I used. I never meant. She could not finish. She did not need to. Miss Marple sat very still, her hands folded over her own in her lap, and felt the particular sorrow that came, always, at the end of these small, terrible unravelings. Not triumph, never that, but a tired, aching pity for the ordinary human weakness that so often lay beneath the worst things people did to one another. Not malice, in this case, only fear and love grown twisted and possessive with loneliness, until it had reached, blindly, for the nearest thing at hand, to hold its daughter close a little longer. "The wax," Miss Marple said at last, very softly. "It wasn't the same as the tin in your kitchen." Enid nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of one trembling hand. "There's an old tin of sealing wax in the pantry. Deep red, the kind my husband used for bottling his wine, years back. I hadn't thought. I was in such a state, resealing the jar, I never thought to check the colour against what she'd used. I only wanted it done before she came back down for tea." She looked at Miss Marple, and there was something almost like relief in her ravaged face. The terrible relief of confession after days of carrying a thing entirely alone. "I've thought, every hour since, of simply telling Inspector Slack myself. I don't know why I hadn't. I think I was waiting for someone to make me." "I think," Miss Marple said, rising slowly and crossing to sit beside her, taking one of Enid's cold hands in both her own. "That grief of this kind is very often too heavy for a person to carry to the police station on their own 2 feet, however much they know they must. It isn't cowardice, my dear, it's simply being human." They sat together a while longer, in the quiet, lavender-scented room, and Miss Marple said nothing more of solicitors, or wax or poison, only stayed, as one stays with a friend in trouble, until Enid's breathing had steadied, and some small, exhausted calm had settled over her. It was Miss Marple herself who walked, afterward, to fetch Inspector Slack, not out of any wish to see justice done harshly, but because she understood, better than most, that some truths once spoken could not be unspoken again, and that it was kinder, in the end, for Enid to go to the police with someone beside her, than to sit alone with her confession until courage failed her a second time. Inspector Slack, to his credit, took the news with rather more gravity than Miss Marple had expected of him, and considerably less satisfaction than she had feared. He listened to Enid's statement, quiet and broken as it was, with his notebook resting unused in his hand for the better part of 10 minutes, and when at last he rose to see her formally taken into custody, his voice, gruff as ever, held something almost gentle in it. "You'll want a solicitor, Mrs. Ashworth. And I'd say, for what it's worth, that a court's like to take a kinder view of this than you're fearing. Intent's a different matter from what happened, and any judge worth his salt will see the difference plain enough." It was, Miss Marple thought, watching from the doorway, as close to kindness as Inspector Slack's official manner generally permitted, and she was glad of it, for Enid's sake. The village, in the days that followed, absorbed the truth of it the way villages always did, slowly and in fragments, passed from garden fence to church pew to the counter of Pym's greengrocer's, until everyone had heard some version of the story, and most had settled, eventually, on something approaching sympathy rather than horror. It was, after all, easier to condemn a stranger than a grieving mother whose only crime had been loving too fiercely and fearing loneliness too much. Harold Pym closed his shop early, the day of Dolly's funeral, and stood at the very back of the churchyard throughout the service, his cap in his hands, saying nothing to anyone. Vera Coombs sent white flowers, though no one had asked her to, and sat with her father afterward in the quiet of their cottage, her own private grief, whatever shape it took, kept carefully to herself, as was her way. Miss Marple attended the funeral as well, in her soft grey, and afterward walked home slowly along the lane, past the church hall where, not 2 weeks before, the fair had filled the summer air with laughter and the smell of warm sugar. The tent had long since been taken down. The trestle tables stood empty and bare in the grass. She thought, as she walked, of how very little separated an ordinary village afternoon from tragedy, how thin the wall really was between the small, familiar comforts of homemade jam and church bells and gossip over garden fences, and the darker things that could grow, quietly and unseen, in the shadow of ordinary human hearts. She had learned this lesson many times over the years, in many villages not unlike this one, and she suspected, with the particular weary patience of long experience, that she would go on learning it as many times again as she was given the chance. It was not, she reflected, a comfortable thought. But then, she had long since stopped expecting the truth of things to be comfortable. It was enough, she thought, settling herself at last into her own chair by her own window, her knitting finally back in her lap where it belonged, that the truth had been found at all, quietly, sorrowfully, and in time. Outside, the village went on exactly as it always had, sunlight moving slowly across rooftops that had seen a great many summers and would, in all likelihood, see a great many more.